And here in red are at least 3 distinct areas which shows that we have been badly destroying the biological diversity. This is about the worst thing, and some people speak about coming the next great extinction. There were 5 great extinctions so far. Then there is a question also of enormous pollution, and then, of course, there's a question of the debate. Again, if you want to look this in terms of numbers, here it is, the ecological footprint, the measure of the human demand on our environment, has been estimated in '92 by Rees and his collaborator. At that time, it was just 1. Just barely we were satisfied. 20 years ago, we did it to a level of 90%. Now we are already at 50% more than that, at 60%. And if we continue with this business as usual, then very soon we will come to 3, which means that you would need 3 Earths to satisfy that. There is a beautiful book by our fellow Andres Weichmann, who is also the co-president of the World Academy, who shows that. Now, this linear graph shows an interesting thing. Of course, shows, Bogdan said that he is modest. I'm a physicist. You know, physicists are about the most arrogant people that exist in the world. We express everything in numbers and then claim that we know the accuracy of these numbers. Sometimes, of course, turns out that we don't. But okay, this is the number that I believe is the correct number. This universe of ours has been created, formed, established 13,798 plus or minus 0.037 billion years ago. We know that number fairly well. At that time, there was physics only, nothing else. It took about 300,000 years when the atom was formed, and that is the beginning of chemistry. And then it took another almost 4 billion years on our Earth that life started, and that is the beginning of biology. Then, of course, is the fire. There, G should be replaced by M, is roughly 1 million years ago that our ancestors, at that time, of course, hunter-gatherers have discovered fire. And that is the beginning of our time. So for a million years, almost for a million years, because this is period much, much shorter, we were hunter-gatherers. And this is still deeply rooted in the way as we behave. We are petty, we are jealous, we are envious. Of course, we are creator. We are the only creator beside God that, of course, is creating something new. And of course, in the music that we just heard is precisely that always creative component. Cognitive revolution starts about roughly 70,000 years ago, and then 12,000 years ago is a famous Neolithic agricultural revolution when we started to domesticate various animals, and of course, instead of being hunter-gatherers, we settled. We had a constant place where to live. So our interaction with the nature, with our own environment, is maybe best described by what is appearing in the first encyclica of Pope Francis, which are the words told by a peasant, I believe in Argentina, to him, where he says, God forgives always, human sometimes, nature never. So these are the things that are true for this global challenge. Our contemporary world is fast changing, as we said, is global, is interdependent. Everything interdepends on everything else. So there is no way how you can solve the problem by assuming that everything else is insignificant. Now, these are to some extent okay. Then there is something which is very, very bad for us in so-called social, economic, and political sphere. And these are the uncertainties. And Nicholas Taleb actually coined the word black swans to describe them. Of course, those of you who are familiar with physics, chemistry, and biology know that uncertainty is, in our field of physics, not a bad word. As a matter of fact, it's a very good word, because we know that the basic equation is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But while we use the Heisenberg uncertainty principle to do a first-rate, accurate, modern science, these uncertainties of the black swans is something that we do not understand. And let me just flash some of the problems. Obviously, destruction of natural and human capital. Obviously, a very low employment rate. Obviously, an enormous inequality. We do believe that these are essential political tasks and that they are achievable. So this is what is necessary. Now, not to be just only gloom, bad stories. My great predecessor, Harlan Cleveland, pointed out that we have to look at our successes. And of course, our time can be best described by the famous opening sentence of Charles Dickens' Tales of the Two Cities. It was the best of time, it was the worst of time. So this is the best of time, this is the worst of time. Why? You can see some of the great successes. As we said, life expectancy increase, GDP, decolonization, more democracy, some very successful treaties, and so on. So this looks very, very good in many ways. A simple answer to a simple question, would you like to live 200 years ago? All of us would answer no, because it was much more miserable time than it is now, except in spite of the fact that occasionally it may look great. So when we look on the next slide, we see very clearly examples of our mistake. Here you have on one axis, on this vertical axis, you see one economic measurement, Human Development Index, okay? And you see on the other, on the horizontal axis, what is called the ecological footprint. This line, red line, shows what the Earth can tolerate. And basically you see that countries, for instance, like Cuba, are just there being at 1 of the ecological footprint. And you see the countries that usually are taken as a good example, for instance, Canada or Norway, not to mention United States, not to mention some of the Middle East countries, really are over-consuming. And that is unnecessary because they are not improving their Human Development Index in any way. Now, yes, please, the next one. Here is an example of the tragedies that we have caused recently, so that you see this in numbers. Here is a number for the World War II casualty of 60 million, and of course there is no doubt it started on September 1st, 1939, and it ended in September of the 45, with after, of course, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Otherwise, of course, this number would be different. This number is 60 million casualties, 3 times bigger than the World War I, comparable, believe it or not, with an enormous damage done by the Spanish flu, considerably larger than the natural disasters throughout the century. And one thing which, of course, sounds here very familiar, the famous study of the democide. What is the democide? Democide is the number of people killed by their own government at that time. Specifically, it includes all Stalin purges, it includes the Holodomor. This number is 262 million. Now, the other number, which is equally shocking, is the recent study which shows that due to the worldwide poverty, people are dying. So this is part of the sin of omission, part of the things that we don't do, what we should be doing, and that number is even huge, is even bigger. Then, of course, we sort of want to live on the edge of a dangerous situation. These are the data from the European Leadership Network showing, with the red, really very serious potential accidents, with the yellow, something which are quite serious, and blue, so to say smaller. But the blue, for instance, would be an excellent example to represent in 1914 the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. When you look on the next slide, you will see the situation in the Baltic area where you see better these red flags and so on. This came up essentially from people in the West. Minister of Foreign Affairs Lavrov replied to something of the similar story, basically indicating, yes, we are in trouble. And what these troubles mean, if we look on the next slide, is when physicists made the nuclear bomb, then of course they were shocked by that. You can read Oppenheimer and so on. Oppenheimer, by the way, is one of the founders of the World Academy. And so in 1947, on the issue of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, they decided to put the doomsday clock. which indicates how far we are from the total catastrophe, from midnight. And they put it at 7 minutes. Then in 1953, where both the Soviets and the USA exploded hydrogen bomb, and you know the story, Teller, Oppenheimer, and so on, they put it to 3 to 2 minutes. Then after the end of the Cold War, it was to 17 minutes. Last year, it was to 5 minutes, and this year it came to 3 minutes. And it might actually be even worse. And these things are by no means simple. What we are talking is the question of intercontinental ballistic missiles that take quite a short time from one to another, and therefore require decision-making, which of course goes beyond any parliament or any of the other things. Now, problems that we have, of course, are deeply rooted in what is called the governance. And of course, the fair and the free elections are something that is the basis of that. And of course, in the lower part of the plot, you see that people equally consider that in their countries elections are free and fair. But when it comes to the question whether the country is run by the will of the people, then the number of those who claim that is run by the will of the people is much, much smaller than the other one, which means that there is a failure in a democratic process, which of course sometimes we take as being a surprise, but let's read the Federalist Papers of the founding fathers of an American democracy, and you will read Madison saying, a famous article entitled "The Tyranny of the Majority." So the fact that you want the majority is not enough. There are checks and balances that should be done. And of course here is the horizontal view of how the work of the United Nations has been considered. You see originally that almost 60% were considering that UN is doing a good job, while 30% had doubt. Now, of course, the situation is totally opposite. What are the problems that we consider to be most important in European Union? As you see, the overwhelming majority of the people considers that the question of employment or low employment is absolutely the #1 problem. When we had a meeting with then President José Manuel Barroso, he absolutely admitted having less than 70% of the employment rate is unacceptable, but this is what we have. So European Union put 75% as a goal to achieve. At that time, Denmark had this higher percentage, nobody else. And of course that means that we are wasting, throwing away 30% of the most valuable capital, and I will show you in a minute why we argue that this is the most valuable capital. The other problem we spoke of is an enormous inequality in distribution, and you see, of wealth, and you see how it looks like. The bottom 99% actually is getting less than 19%. Now, why do we worry? I mean, why should I be concerned if you are getting much more, if you have much more money than I am? As a matter of fact, if I'm a good person, I would be only happy and satisfied that you are doing that. But the reasons are the following, as you can see. This is, I'm not going through the work of Thomas Piketty, of Milanovic, or Salah Martin, and so on. I'm showing you just a very simple plot made by two British MDs, where they actually indicated that if you plot the GDP, on the other hand, with respect to the question of inequality, then the more inequality it is, the worse the situation is. So United States has higher infant mortality rate, it has lower life expectancy, and all of the other indicators are worse and worse. And let's skip this one so that we are in touch. This is the sheet which shows actually that the most important is the capital, the human capital. See, for Japan, for the United States, and for all of the countries, human capital is much more important than is the natural capital, and much, much more important than money and all of the other things there are. So, what we strongly believe, and this is what Gary will be saying in his part, is yes, we need a new paradigm. A new paradigm has to be focused on the human beings. And that is the essential message we want to say. Thank you very much.